Hi, friends. Welcome to the first episode of Catholicism 101, Forever Learning and Living the Faith. And today we are going to be talking about the domestic church, which is the family, and the education of children. So when we talk about this, we naturally have to start talking about marriage because that's where families come from marriage. So the church teaches that the primary purpose for the sacrament of marriage is twofold. First, it is for the unity and good of the spouses to lead one another to heaven. And secondly, this goes hand in hand with the first one. It is for the procreation and education of children. So essentially, as a married man or a woman, you are called to lead your family to heaven. And if we want to get our children to heaven, we are entrusted with the responsibility of cultivating their love for the Lord and building a strong foundation for their relationship with God. And it's just kind of a natural principle that you can't really love someone you don't know. So the way we understand catechesis, which is the teaching of the faith, is introducing and helping our children come to know the Lord. So who He is, how He loves us, and what He calls us to do out of love. So in helping our children fall in love with the Lord and come to love Him deeper and just on a more profound level, the church is always emphasizing that it is first and foremost the parents' privilege and responsibility to educate their children in the faith. And so I have a few quotes here from church documents. So the first one comes from the Catechism of the Catholic Church, and this is paragraph 2223. And it says, parents have the first responsibility for the education of their children. And then in paragraph 2226, it says, family catechesis precedes, accompanies, and enriches other forms of instruction in the faith. Parents have the mission of teaching their children to pray and to discover their vocation as children of God. And the church doesn't stop there. She goes on in the National Directory for Catechesis, and she says, parents are the most influential agents of catechesis for their children. They have a unique responsibility for the education of their children. They are the first educators or catechists. And then St. John Paul II, in his document Familiaris Consortio, John Paul II says, hence, parents must be acknowledged as the first and foremost educators of their children. And get this is a big one. He says, their role as educators is so decisive that scarcely anything can compensate for their failure in it. So just from these 4 quotes, we can see that the church is really reminding parents, number one, that this is a big responsibility, and it is their responsibility. We can see when we look at this united with the purposes of marriage as, for the unity and good of the spouses to lead each other to heaven, and then the procreation and education of children to lead their children to heaven. Marriage is kind of a big deal, and not everyone is called to it, though that it may seem like that in our popular culture. So marriage is a big deal. Family is a big deal. It is a big responsibility, and it's not to be taken lightly. One of the things I have the privilege of doing is meeting with first-time parents as they're preparing to have their children baptized. And we always talk about the push and pull of these 2 concepts. So first, parents always want their children to be better off than they were themselves. They always want to give them better than they had it, and they want them to do better than they've done. But I quickly remind them that we can't give what we don't have. And this applies to our faith too. So if you want your child to have a strong faith life, you first have to grow in faith yourself. When you get married and when you have children, you have to recognize the reality that you're no longer responsible for only yourself, but you're responsible for your spouse and your children too. When you get your children baptized, you have to recognize that your own faith life is responsible for your child's growing faith. And let me give you an example of kind of what I'm talking about here. So if you want your child to have a strong faith life, you have to grow in your own faith. even if that's not your motivation. Like, even if you yourself are not your own motivation for growing in faith, if you know you're going to do it for your kid. So what I mean is, if you don't want to go to church on Sunday, if you don't want to get out of bed and go to church on Sunday morning for yourself, then you need to find the motivation to get up and go for your children. You will still receive grace, even if grace for yourself is not your primary motivation for growing. Pretty cool. God is merciful, and even if you don't want to be there for yourself, he's still going to bless you because you're acting selflessly, and that is fruitful, and that is fertile, and it is good. So we've been talking primarily about the role of parents in the education of children, but what about the role of the church? So the church and your parish is responsible for aiding parents in the education of their children, because we have to recognize, as the church teaches, that the family and parents are the first and most important teachers of the faith. The church is not to be a replacement for family catechesis, because on its own, it's not sufficient as the sole teacher of the faith in a child's life. But rather, as the Catechism says, the church is the heart of the liturgical life of Christian families. And that comes from paragraph 2226. The church's Eucharistic celebration, the Mass, is from where all of our family catechesis comes and where it's directed towards. Especially when it comes to sacramental prep for First Communion and First Reconciliation, and to a degree, Confirmation, but most especially for First Sacraments. Doing sacramental prep at home with your kids should not be seen as additional homework. That's not why it's given, but it's given so that you have a graced opportunity with your children to share faith as you prepare them to take a monumental step in their faith journey, because they get to see and they get to hear from you why your family makes it a priority to go to Mass every Sunday. So it begins with your own faith. It always begins with your own faith, because you cannot give what you don't have. So if you want your children to be better off than you were as a child, then you give that to them. Then you do better for them than you were given as a child. Something I run into a lot of times is that many parents have this sort of imposter syndrome, or just like a general uncomfiness with being the primary catechist of their children, with teaching them the faith. And whatever that comes from, whatever the reason may be, that's kind of why we have this podcast. That's kind of why I have my whole job, is to resource parents and help you learn what you need to learn so that you can pass it on to your children. And so I wanted to pass on right now a couple of resources that I think are really wonderful in kind of giving you a foundation to pass things on to your children, because again, you can't give what you don't have. And so the first one actually has to do with sacramental prep. And we are in a Eucharistic revival right now in the United States. And yeah, so there is this series on Formed by the Augustine Institute called Presence, the Mystery of the Eucharist. And it's 3 episodes that are between 30 and 40 minutes long. And honestly, they are so wonderful. I've actually used this series for sacramental prep for a couple teenagers, and it went really well. But I think, especially for parents, it is incredible. And it lays a really solid, really beautiful foundation that will reignite your own faith in the Eucharist. And again, if you want your children to have a love for the Eucharist, you might need to have that for yourself first, so that they can see why it's so important you go to Mass every Sunday while your family goes. So that's my first one. And if you're a member of our parish, we have a Formed subscription, and you can go to formed.org/sign up and enter in our parish information and have your account that way. If you're not a member of our parish, check with your own parish and see if they have a Formed subscription and sign up through them. The other thing I wanted to share with you all is my resource list for educating yourself and your family in the Catholic faith. And this is a list of different books and podcasts and many other things, YouTube videos, all of that that I have been compiling over the past 2 years, and it stays changing every once in a while, but I'm going to have the most up-to-date, most recent version linked in the show notes for you to look over. And it's got links and QR codes and descriptions and pictures, and a couple things actually have discount codes with them that I'm not affiliated with, but I have just found for you. So I hope you enjoy that and you find something that intrigues you that you want to learn more about. But I hope you have enjoyed this first episode of Catholicism 101. And I wanted to remind you too about the question box that is linked in the show notes. If you have a question maybe about something you've heard today or just something in general out of left field, whatever it may be, send it to me and I will be answering those questions periodically as I release episodes. So stay tuned for the next one coming in July. And until then, have a blessed day.